Hello, Americans. I'm Kent McNall. It's Constitution time. Today is December 7th, and it is 79 years since the attack on Pearl Harbor. And as always on this day, I want to say a big thank you to all the military folks from that time who gave their lives in their service to the United States of America, and all of our military people since and today. Thank you for your service to our country. Today we have an interesting topic and a guest, and I'll just talk about that for a moment before we introduce our guest. Over the weekend, there's quite a bit of press about, as always, our Republican senators and many other Republicans who won't yet talk about the fact that Joe Biden is the president-elect of the United States. In Georgia, we have a very intense runoff for two key Senate seats. And the Democrats in that race don't want to talk about an issue that keeps coming up, which is, do they intend to pack the Supreme Court? And I find it very interesting that the Democrats don't want to answer that question. Well, there's a lot behind that question and a lot of interesting topics about what packing the court really means and what it really takes. Both the Republicans and the Democrats seem to feel that it's some kind of foregone conclusion that if the Democrats want to pack the Supreme Court, they'll be able to. And I think that's far from the case. There's a lot of really interesting history behind this idea of how many justices are or should be on the Supreme Court. And what does packing it even mean? Well, it turns out that the number of justices on the Supreme Court have changed many times over our 250 plus years. And a lot of very famous presidents are involved in some of those changes. Also, one of the things that we'll talk about on this subject is what's the need for this? Why has the 6-3 majority on the Supreme Court? First of all, why is it even a problem? But how did it come to be? And that gets back to the infamous rules of the Senate that have to do with the nuclear option. You know, not very many people that I talk to even know what the nuclear option is. So we might talk about that just a little bit. But to get going on this, I'd like to introduce our guest, and I'll work hard to press the right buttons in the right sequence here. Hello, Stephen.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Welcome back. I'd like to reintroduce our guest and friend of the show, Mr. Stephen Stack, who has kindly agreed to jump on and discuss this topic with us today. So, Stephen, this is an interesting ball of twine to unwind, but what would you say is the reason that it's even important to think about changing the number of justices on the Supreme Court right now?
Yeah, I think the primary reason from most of the liberal side is they feel the court is underrepresented. They feel that because most of the current justices have been decided by conservative presidents and Senate, they are underrepresented on the court as it stands, especially with the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and replacing with a arguably more conservative justice.
It certainly represents an imbalance when compared to the populace as far as the right-leaning court versus the much more left-leaning population of the United States, at least if we look at who votes and what the actual population is of those Democratic areas.
Mhm. Certainly.
So I know that we talked a little bit before we came on about the history of Supreme Court justice, number of justice changes. The Constitution does not actually say, I believe, how many justices there should be. It says that the Congress, not really the president, is in charge of changing how many justices there are, and they do that through legislation, which has to be signed by the president, of course. But the first president that really dealt with this was George Washington, and he initially instituted 6 justices. But I was really interested to find that the first change happened by President number 3, Thomas Jefferson, and that was a change from 6 to 5 to prevent him from being able to name a justice. Apparently someone had died or was going to die or whatever, but I thought that was a pretty interesting, dirty trick to play on one of the founders of the country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely was an interesting move to decrease it down to 5, especially since it was then re-increased back to 6 about a year later.
You talked about some interesting changes that happened around 1837.
Yeah, in 1837, it was changed so in 1807, it was changed up to 7 to kind of give it there would always be a deciding vote as long as it was full. And then in 1837, it was increased to 9. And that was, I don't remember the exact circumstances around that one, but that one sort of stands alone in no other changes around that time period. So there was a bulk of changes, 1801, 1802, 1807, and then another bulk, 1863, 66, and 69. But 1837 kind of stands by itself, where it seems that for about 30 years, 25 years-ish, everyone was sort of happy with the number of justices being 9.
So really, it ping-pongs back and forth if someone changes it or does something related to the Supreme Court that's objectionable to the other party, you get that equal and opposite reaction.
Yeah.
So I think it's fairly safe to say that some of the things that happened with starting with Merrick Garland and then going on to the latest Supreme Court justice being named are the reason that a reaction is being contemplated or would be contemplated, because there was some quote-unquote dirty pool there, at least according to the other side. But really, this all stems back to Harry Reid and the use of the nuclear option back in 2013 to create a situation essentially where filibusters could be broken, Rule 20 of the Senate, and they could get more judges named, which they were having difficulty with because every single judge was being pushed back against. And at that time, the opposition leadership in the Senate said, "You will regret this." And they did when Merrick Garland rolled around. And now the Amy Coney Barrett situation. And what that has resulted in is a 6-3 conservative majority on the Supreme Court, and the desire to bring that back into balance. So it's interesting how that comes back around to the erasure of norms in the Senate and folks taking advantage of things that are going to come back and visit them again. But Stephen, what is really involved in, I mean, everybody seems to think that the Democrats can snap their fingers and change the number of justices. But what's really involved, and what are the real odds that the Democrats or Republicans could make that happen without a supermajority in the House and the Senate and the presidency?
It's definitely somewhat unlikely because it would need to pass both the House and the Senate, um, and then be signed by the president. So, especially with the Senate, if everything goes the way the Democrats are hoping, and they manage to get both seats in Georgia, they would be 50-50 split, and the vice president would decide issues that split down the party lines. But there are a lot of Democrats who've been pretty vocally outspoken saying that they don't support increasing the Supreme Court size. So the Democrats would need to rally everyone, even people who've been vocally against it, to to vote to increase the size. And especially considering the polls are a little unsure, but everything I've seen is like 33 to 45% of the country supports it. So not even half the country supports increasing the Supreme Court size. Now, those numbers may have changed recently. I think the last one I saw was a month or two ago, but
With a 50-50 split on really uh, big items like this, people cross the line. Joe Manchin is one that comes to mind, and senator from Alaska is always crossing over. So
mm-hmm.
there's no sure bet on something like this. And then of course you still have to name the justices and get them through the system. So, but I think
Yep.
are there other potential benefits? I mean, if we weren't fighting about this, would there be other potential benefits to expanding the number of justices on the Supreme Court? After all, like the Senate, uh, each justice represents more and more and more people all the time. When the country was young, each justice maybe represented 1 million people. Now each justice represents 30 or 40 million people. Um, so, are there some benefits in just thinking about expanding the number of justices on the Supreme Court?
Yeah, I think there's some definite benefits, even if it was done in a way that could be agreeable by both sides. If you were to spread it out or something, um, so that it's not court packing in the traditional sense. Um, the fact that currently the Supreme Court hears between 100 and 150 cases each year of the over 7,000 that they get. Um, if you were to expand the court and maintain the numbers that are needed to actually hear a case, um, you could get through more cases that potentially do deserve to be heard by the Supreme Court, but there's just not enough time and they fall below the priority line.
And that's not because they don't want to hear them. They hear as many cases as they can.
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't heard the 7,000 number. I'm sure there are many petitions to the court that they do turn away for other reasons, but I'm sure they would like to get to a lot more of those cases.
Yep. Yeah, the 7,000 is the full list of petitions, and there's I don't know the numbers, but there's probably a large percentage of that are pretty clear cut and don't necessarily need to be heard by the Supreme Court. But I, there's probably a large percentage that it would be good to get a weigh in from the highest court in the country.
There is diversity on the Supreme Court, but I think it could be much more representative of the people of the United States. Certainly, a better split between men and women, more diversity racially. Um, so, more justices would allow for that as well. Now, you mentioned a couple of other ideas that are kicking around out there about the Supreme Court and even some of the history. For example, that Supreme Court justices were initially expected to still sit on the circuit courts and hear cases, and that kind of
Hmm.
just went away. Not because the Constitution or the law was changed, but just because they said, you don't have to do that. So, what
Yeah.
are a couple of those ideas?
So one of the big ones I've seen that um, I personally think is something to think about and potentially explore is doing more of a lottery system the same way that the appeals courts are done. So there's a pool of judges and justices for the appeals courts, and each case gets three judges randomly assigned to it. You could do the same thing with the Supreme Court, pulling from the entire appeals courts to say, all right, well, for each case, you could even leave justice, like the chief justice, always being on there. So each case might pull eight random judges or five random judges to get it to the six mark. Um, and then you've got about 190 Supreme Court justices who are probably able to get through more of those cases and more representative of the country potentially.
Interesting. So, at its base, and I've talked about this issue several times on Constitution Time, but this still gets back to the the rules of the Senate, the rules the Senate made for themselves that allowed them to be in this extraordinary power position that I don't think the Constitution gives them. And when I looked at really the detail of the nuclear option, which deserves its own show, but basically, all that boils down to is this series of secret little moves that the Senate makes uh, in response to a particular type of emotion of motion in the Senate that allows the majority leader to make his own secret little move. And the bottom line is they end up being able to stop debate on an issue. That's what the nuclear option is. And I never realized that that's all it was. And there's a couple of really good wiki articles on it. Just look up nuclear option Wikipedia. And they even have a transcript of Harry Reid's moves that he made in 2013. And the idea that something as important and as critical as Supreme Court justices and federal court judges being at the mercy of some secret handshake in the Senate is ridiculous. And
Mm-hmm.
that gets back to an idea I floated on Constitution Time that could occur, which is might the president just step in with executive orders to say, yeah, you're not doing that anymore? Um, certainly,
It,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, there definitely is there's another precedent that has kind of been upheld thus far where the Senate has to confirm justices, but there's some gray area where if the Senate refuses to vote on a justice, whether or not that justice just ends up appointed at that point. Um, it's a little vague in the actual description, and constitutional scholars kind of disagree on what would happen if a president said, all right, well, if you're not going to vote, then my appointment just goes forward.
Yeah, we find those gray areas are in there and ready to be filled in by the president, apparently. So I think some of that might have to happen to straighten some of this out. Um, but that might be the subject of another Constitution Time show. So I think that it's long odds um, to hope or think because personally, it's not something I hope necessarily. What I hope is that we can fill in some of these blanks that seem to be there so that this kind of thing doesn't keep happening. Or perhaps come up with um, better structure around the naming of things like Supreme Court justices so that you have a standard that says neither side will get more than one vote ahead in the Supreme Court. Something that hopefully we could all work out together. But tough going on Capitol Hill these days.
Yeah, certainly. And hopefully the next administration is actually able to live up to their promises of being able to come to agreements about really tough issues like this.
It'd be interesting to know how the justices themselves feel about this. I think they pretty much stay quiet on these issues. But I've got to believe that it creates difficulty for them as well. And one comfort I've taken over the years is, and seems to bear out at times, is that even if all 9 of the justices were suddenly conservative or suddenly liberal, that they would balance themselves back out. And you might still end up with 5-4s towards that side. But I'm guessing you wouldn't have that many 9-0s. So we might be finding that out in the next couple of years.
I mean, that's the main thing that kind of stopped the FDR's attempt to increase the court size was Justice Roberts kind of veering off with the Washington State minimum wage ruling. Was Roberts kind of switched sides a little bit to vote with the more liberal bloc, and that was kind of the final nail in the coffin for FDR's bill that he was kind of fronting.
I assume you're talking about a different Justice Roberts. He's not that old.
No, different Roberts.
Stephen, any other thoughts about this or anything that you researched that you wanted to make sure to get a chance to talk about?
Not offhand. The only other thing that I came across that was interesting was the potential of enacting term limits so that each president would end up with 2 nominations each term, which would take the only way I've seen that would potentially even work is it would be a very slow. Any new justices named would have an 18-year term. So it would take, 18 to 20 years before we were in that boat. But it was an interesting option.
The justices do seem to go on and on. I don't remember any instances of a justice who really should have stepped down that didn't, but I'm sure that they exist because it's a lifetime appointment and a lot of power.
There have been 3 justices that stepped down because they were likely going to be impeached. And they decided to step down and resign before they were impeached. But other than that, most justices go for a very long time.
Stephen, interesting conversation. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We'll look forward to having you on again very soon. Please say hello to your family.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Stephen.
Bye.
And that's Constitution time for today. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon as well. Take care, Americans. Please be safe.